a just authoritative. He educates and organizes a local, national, and international level for peaceful and just alternative to U.S. foreign and military policy, concentrating on great power tension, nuclear weapons, and impact of U.S. foreign military base and Pentagon spending. So, Mr. Joseph Carson, you are welcome to speak to us in 15 minutes. In a subsequent time, after your colleagues have spoken, questions and answers will come. So, Mr. Carson, you are welcome.
Thank you, Tyson. And I want to thank Ernest and Stephanie for setting this up and for inviting me. To be clear in the beginning, I'm hardly an expert on Africa. And so I'll talk about some of the broader dynamics here. And I really look forward to hearing from Baroness so that I can learn more about the impacts on Africa. First to say is, was mentioned before, the war is having huge impacts on the costs of petroleum, natural gas, the sanctions, and the blockade in Odessa are forcing up the price of wheat and other grains coming out of out of Ukraine and also from Russia. So this is going to have a global impact, and certainly on Africa. The other thing is that it was reported earlier today in the Financial Times, I guess maybe actually yesterday, that Russia has approached China to obtain more weapons for its war. And today there was a meeting between U.S. National Security Advisor Sullivan and the senior Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi. And really the outcomes of these two developments, I think, will largely determine the world that we face in the coming period. The degree to which China and Russia either form a tighter alliance, or in which there remains some Chinese independence from Russia. And that, of course, will have impacts on trade and US and Chinese competition in Africa. Just to say that here in the United States and across much of the world, the peace movements have been calling for an immediate ceasefire, for all foreign troops to leave Ukraine, and for diplomatic negotiations to, in large measure, to resume. But there also have been some negotiations with no fruit at this point between Ukraine and Russia. I think it's important to understand that with Russia's invasion, we have the collapse, the end of what passed for the 30-year post-Cold War disorder. And in the coming weeks and months, we're going to see a restructuring and creation of some form of a new world system. But it's at this point extremely fluid. And of course, this will have enormous impacts for the decisions made by leaders and communities across Africa. Here in the United States, many of us here in our peace movement have been struck by the hypocrisies and some of the ironies in that as bad as this war is, and it's terrible, it also holds up a mirror to what the United States has done for many years, invading other countries. One of Putin's goals, but not the only one, I believe, was to basically create a Russian sphere of influence further to the West to help ensure that there would not be attacks coming from NATO, given Russian history of invasions from Napoleon, the Kaiser, and Hitler. So you have an invasion here to maintain a sphere. The United States has maintained what's called the Monroe Doctrine for 200 years, essentially saying that no foreign country should intervene in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, and that this is a United States sphere. And to maintain this, the United States has invaded numerous countries, has organized regime change coups, And even in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala in 1954, the United States has prepared and or threatened to initiate nuclear war. And with the very dangerous Russian nuclear threat that's been made, the reality, unfortunately, is that on about 30 occasions following Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings during international crises and wars, the United States has prepared or threatened to initiate nuclear war. In the lead up to both of the invasions or wars with Iraq and Trump's famous fire and fury threats against Korea. So, when I was a student 9 million years ago, one of my classmates was a guy named Bill Clinton, and our professor of international relations said that the study of international relations is analogous to studying the rules of the game of mafia families. Well, what we're doing here today is certainly international relations. We are not mafia families, but in terms of what great powers have been doing, it increasingly looks like this. To say that the nuclear danger, I don't want to inflate how intense it is, but at the same time, we have to take it very, very seriously. When you have nuclear alerts, you have increased dangers of miscalculations or accidents. And the other nuclear dimension of what's happening here is that back in 1994, Ukraine surrendered, gave up the nuclear weapons that had been left behind in Ukraine by the Soviet Union. And they did so in exchange for guarantees that Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty would be respected, including by Russia. That's now been violated. The whole world sees it. And one of the things that this is doing is encouraging advocates for nuclear weapons proliferation to say it's time for their countries to either have the United States move its nuclear weapons into their countries, as has happened with the former Prime Minister of Japan, or to be saying that maybe their country should be getting nuclear weapons. It's certainly being looked at quite closely, I'm sure, in Iran. The war grows out of, I think, very serious blunders and miscalculations on both sides. In the period leading up to the war, there were track 2 discussions trying to find a diplomatic way forward. And what we identified in those discussions were a moratorium on new NATO memberships. I mean, the idea that Ukraine was going to join NATO was nonsense. The French and the British were insisting that they would never let Ukraine enter into NATO. And the truth of the matter is it wasn't incipient. It wasn't about to happen. So on the one hand, Biden could have signaled more strongly an end to expansion of NATO. And on the other hand, it's sort of a flimsy excuse for Putin because he wasn't facing that immediate danger. There were the Minsk II agreements that ended the war in 2014. And among other things, they had committed the Ukrainian government to create a federated state, to change the constitution so that those who were Russian speakers, who maybe were Russian Orthodox religion, and whose economic ambitions and identity were closer to Russia, more in the East, that they could have more autonomy. And the other side of it was that Russia was to leave the Donetsk region. Well, they weren't fulfilled, but the thought was that we could go back to Minsk, we could build on Minsk to create a neutral and federated Ukraine, one that wouldn't threaten Russia and would reinforce human rights for all people. And with the Russian military surrounding Ukraine from 3 sides and recognizing the possibility of war, Russia had enormous diplomatic leverage at that moment. And there were calls here in the United States from actually including the former US ambassador to Russia, who's a man who absolutely hates Putin, who was saying it was time to be negotiating a new grand bargain with Russia, a new Helsinki 2.0 agreement, and had had Putin picked up on that, or had Biden said he was fully behind it, the war might have been avoided. There was a sense that we need to go forward, and I think this still holds on the other side of this disaster, to be having negotiations to update and renew the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, and basically to ban nuclear weapons from the Atlantic to the Urals, to renegotiate the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, which could provide for more distance between the militaries, reducing military exercises and so on, and for strategic stability talks. So these were all on the table. I think they still remain on the table, but nobody's paying much attention to the table right now. I think we need to be clear, obviously, that the war is an absolute catastrophe. The death and destruction in Ukraine is intense. You have more than 2,600,000 people have fled, primarily to Poland, but to other countries. Of course, the irony here, irony is a polite word, is the racist dimension of this. So that just a few weeks ago, on the Polish border, Syrian and other refugees were being hit with water cannon and being kept from coming in. But in part because so many of the Ukrainians are white Christians, are people that the Poles could identify with, they're being let in. There's also heavy costs on the Russian side. We have, in addition to the Ukrainian soldiers and civilians who are being killed, quite a number of Russian troops are being killed. This war has not been as easy as Putin had anticipated. And what the ramifications of that will be, we don't know. Most Russian people, even families of the soldiers, don't know what's happening in the war. It's forbidden in Russia for them to use the terms war or invasion. Media is basically saying it's a special military operation. But as the body bags come back, that will be intense. And the other very unhappy dimension in Russia is the centralization of control and the repression of free speech and human rights there. So it's now illegal to be using the terms war or invasion as people who know are trying to communicate. Social media and other media is being shut down, and people are facing up to 15 years in prison for speaking the truth. I was on a call last night when I was told that maybe they face even worse than that. And a dear friend of Reiner's and mine in Russia at the moment is under great pressure from the FSB, and you've had about 200,000 people from Russia have left since the war began, not wanting to be associated with it. What else can I say here? The economic sanctions are, in the United States, we've had one set of sanctions after the next. And in this case, with removing Russia from the SWIFT international banking system, the sanctions are hitting not only the oligarchs whose yachts and wealth is being secured by the United States and other NATO allies, but you have huge economic consequences for the Russian people as a whole. And again, speaking to the man I just made reference to, the Russian, he was saying that those broad sanctions are counterintuitive, counterproductive. In fact, they are leading people to rally around Putin, believing the rhetoric that Russia is surrounded by enemies. So that doesn't help. Just a couple of more points to make here. To go on forever. I mean, we look at the deep origins of this war, but I won't do that now. Maybe we can look at it in the Q&A period. But we do face dangers here of escalation through accidents and miscalculations. The Russians hit a major base in Western Ukraine. huge, 140 square miles, training, and also a site where weapons being brought in from the west were transiting. They hit it with 35 cruise missiles. Considerable death, and this is a war. But the danger is it's like about 12 or 15 miles from the Polish border. So the danger here is that an accident or miscalculation could lead to an attack on a NATO country, and that in turn could lead to the invocation of Article 5 of the NATO treaty, meaning that the United States and the other NATO nations would have to come to war. Similarly, there are President Zelensky has issued a call for the creation of a no-fly zone. The idea here being that US and NATO planes would prevent Russian planes from being able to fly over Ukraine and to launch cruise missiles as they did just a couple of days ago. The problem with this is that a no-fly zone requires the countries that have created it or enforcing it to shoot down the planes of the other side. So that would mean the United States and NATO planes shooting down Russian planes, which would bring us immediately into a NATO-Russia war with just unbelievable consequences. That's the kind of thing that could lead to an escalation and nuclear war. Maybe the two final points to make is the sense of danger that we face here as Putin finds himself perhaps in a difficult situation here. His military didn't prevail as quickly as had anticipated. It's a long war. It seems that he's pursuing it in some ways like he pursued the wars in Syria and in Chechnya with just massive destruction. But the reality is that it has also forged unity, not only within NATO, where you have new countries, Sweden and Finland, more eager to join NATO, but it's also fused resistance and identity in Ukraine. So the expectation is that even if Russian forces are able to seize control of the cities and the countryside, we face a long war, bleeding Russia in many ways, as the Afghanistan war bled both Russia and the United States. And in this circumstance, and plus with the economic sanctions on Russia, the question is what will happen if Putin finds himself increasingly cornered? What desperate acts might he take in order to break that situation? So that's something that we need to face out. And then just the last point to make here is that we're facing what's generally called a new Cold War 2.0, or in some cases even an ice age. We're going to have deep divisions, chasms between the West and Russia, much of the world. I mean, Russia is largely isolated, but I mean, look at the fact that South Africa abstained in the vote condemning it. India as well, the perception that their interests don't align totally with the United States and Europe. But we're facing a reconstructed world. And in this, on the other side of the worst of the fighting, we're going to have to be resuming negotiations for a common security order, much along the lines of that track 2 agenda that I had mentioned in the beginning. So I'll close with that. I look forward to hearing the other talks and to your questions, and this will be an important learning experience for me as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Key issues that I got from your presentation: discrimination, wherein you only spoke of African, Ukrainian, and other people at the border who have Christian background and what so forth. But we should appreciate you for your analysis and thought on this such war. But to go further and reserve our questions for the next, after the next panel are through with that discussion. Now we will go to Ronnie Byrne. Ronnie Byrne is the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau, a Peace Nobel Prize winner, as organization and one of the main speakers of the movement in Germany. He leads the German chapter of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, Scientists for Peace and Sustainability, and the International Network of Engineers and is the speaker on the subject of NATO, militarization of Europe, military spending, responsibility of scientists. He is the author of several books, including Esteem and Peace, and about a biography of the Peace Nobel laureate, Joseph Rabelais. Mr. Ronnie? Are you there, Ronnie?
Yes. Yeah, dear colleagues.
Yeah, Ronnie, you are welcome to this platform. We want to hear from your side, your expertise, because you have been in the field of NATO, speaking on a lot of issues of NATO. So we want to see your thoughts on Ukraine and Russia war. We want to see your thoughts, how well you can articulate to acknowledge us on Ukraine and Russia war. Thank you ever so much. You are welcome.
Thank you, Tyson. Thank you, dear colleagues, for the invitation. You know, to speak after my distinguished friend Joseph Gerson, it is really not easy to find further points which we have to mention. So I will concentrate on the question, which I think is highly interesting. What are the consequences for Africa? But I'm speaking definitely not from African perspective. I'm speaking from the perspective of a European, watching Africa definitely with European eyes. The first one I would like to mention is, and this is the continuation of Joseph's talk, is the geostrategic consequences. You know, when it's correct that we are in the middle of a fight for a new world order, because between powers which become weaker and powers which become stronger, then Ukraine is in the middle point of this fight. Because when you are looking to the landscape, you can see that Ukraine on one side is a country between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, as a really in the middle between both, as a linkage between East and West Europe, which was historical linkage and actual linkage. And the same, it's a country between Europe and Asia, so the influence in Ukraine, the dominance in Ukraine, the hegemony in Ukraine is always important for the hegemony of the Eurasian area. And since Brzezinski and Kissinger, we know that Eurasia is the future of human being and the influence in the world. So this fight between the superpowers which become weaker, above all the United States of America, politically, morally, ethically, and the upcoming countries from Asia, above all China, but also India and other countries, is made in this area around Ukraine. And the Western want to have Ukraine under control. This was a key point for a lot of problems. And Russia want to keep their influence. That is the background of the fight. And the Western was not happy with the neutral Ukraine, wanted to have Ukraine totally under the control of the European Union and NATO. So for me, the first winner of this war are the United States, because they were weakening on one side Russia, economically, politically, it is more isolated than in the past. Economically, the war is for Russia a disaster. And also it has European Union, above all under control, because the European Union always, when something happened under the umbrella of NATO, is a weaker junior partner. So it shifts again the international constellation more or less in the direction of empowering the United States and partly Europe. And this weakened the fight for overcoming the 500 years old colonialist system. That is the consequences also for Africa. And we will see the consequences in the future which much more influence of the old imperial countries in the continent. The second, and now I'm coming to the people in Africa. Ukraine was the biggest exporter of grain and wheat, above all to Africa. 60% of the export of Ukraine grain and wheat was going to Africa. 25% in addition was going to the world, to the UN food program, was also a main support for Africa. This is over. And also over is the export from Russia, which was the second biggest exporter of grain and wheat to Africa. So we will come to a situation where on one side, grain and wheat will be much more expensive. Experts are speaking from it will be 3 times expensive, 300% more than in the past. And on the other side, you will have only a small amount of wheat and grain because other parts of the world are also needed it and are easier and can even pay the higher prices. So this means the consequences will be, from my understanding, a dramatic food crisis in Africa, which will enlarge hunger and poverty on the whole continent as one of the consequences. The second consequence is combined the food question with the question of energy, which means above gas and oil. The oil prices are now by $120. People are speaking, or experts are speaking, that they can go up to 200 or 250. The gas prices doubled during the last weeks and months. And this is also a problem for Africa. Who should pay these expenses? Who should pay the new prices? This means we will come in Africa, but maybe also in other parts of the world, to a world economic crisis, which is mainly on the background and on the back of the poor and normal people. In Africa, but not also only in Africa, we also will suffer in the rich countries in the first world. Or to say correct, the poorer people in the rich country will also be affected from this change or this rising of the gas and oil prices. This is the second big problem for many parts of the world. And in addition, supply changes and raw materials in many cases will be much more expensive. Also a consequence for the whole world, which enlarge the economic crisis. And the economic crisis, this we know from the past, will be mainly and especially brutal in all the fragile countries and fragile continents. And Africa definitely is a fragile continent. The next consequences I see is the climate and the climate change. No one is speaking any longer about the climate change. Last Monday, the IPCC announced a new report. It was 10 seconds in the news, less than 1 day, but it was the most brutal report in the history of the IPCC. They announced that even in the 2030s and 2040s, we will see the consequences of the climate change. And frankly speaking, forget the 1.5 degree. It will not happen. It will absolutely more. And nothing will be done because the countries are going to war. The countries are enlarging their military budgets. Joseph was saying this to the United States, but maybe the country which has the biggest rise in military spending is Germany. Can you imagine that we now have a special military fund for 100 billion and in addition, enlarge our military expenditure every year to more than 2% of the GDP. That is the reality. And who should pay the resistance against climate change? Who should pay the consequences of climate change? Or all the changes, the social-economical, social-ecological changes, which are needed to have the climate change under 2 degrees. That is the consequences, and I have not to tell you what are the consequences of the climate change for Africa. I think you know this much better than me. I know the pictures, and these pictures are more than horrible. And you also know, like me, that the consequences of this situation in Africa will be more conflicts, more civil wars, more attacks, more destroyment of the societies in the different countries. This is, for me, the third very important effect. The next one is connected to this, is we have an armament race in all NATO countries. Sweden has now 2% GDP. Sweden, a country which is neutral officially. Germany will go over 2%. The United States are by 3%. Russia is by 3.5%, even when it's in the total amount a quite low budget. But this money is away, and it's not spent for support and development, not spent for helping countries for self-organizing systems, not available for new developments in the South. So we will have a shift from the support from the Central Western countries, from development money to military money. I know the double fact of developing money from our countries, but not to support your countries means also, creates also big problems. So you will feel by the budget of your governments, by the budget which you are getting from international organization, you will feel the shift in the Central European countries and in US, in all the NATO countries, from civil use of the money to military spending. And this will also create, again, consequences for Africa. And the big companies in Europe and the United States are looking for new resources, for new fossil resources, for new resources, which they are losing now in Russia and in Ukraine. Ukraine because it's destroyed, in Russia because of the blockades and all the sanctions. Where they are going to? They will go to Africa. But they are not doing equal trade relations with your country. They will exploit your country. They will take what they can to the cheapest prices which they can get. Not looking to the people, they are not interested in the people. So this is also a consequence which you will see. And this also means that the shift away from fossil energy and fossil resources to renewable resources will be very long-term, will be stopped and not developed during the next years. Also a consequence which it has consequences for the climate and for the societal development. So what I can see is quite brutal consequences for Africa, but also for all parts of the world, always including the United States and Europe. We will not exclude it from these problems, but the brutality of these problems will be above all in the more poor countries in the world. What does this have as consequences for us? I will not repeat what Joseph was saying to the policy of common security. That is absolutely background. Without common security, without cooperative relations between all the countries, and this includes the NATO countries and Russia, we will not solve any of the global problems, above all not the climate problem. Second is we need again a discussion about disarmament. Disarmament has to come back to the international agenda. Now we are in a situation that we will not spend 2 trillion for military budget. We will spend 2.5, maybe even in some years 3 trillion for military budget. This will not solve any of the global problems. And third, I think we need very much in general a discussion, what does this mean, justice for Africa? And this brings up all the environmental, the development, and the social questions related always to the question of democracy and developing of the countries. I think this is points we have to discuss, we have to bring on the agenda. So this is, for IPB, this means we have to continue what we are doing. I'm very thankful that we have our African network. And I think these African network have huge challenges in front of each other and to discuss with us. And I'm happy to contribute today a little bit, and hopefully it helps for the future discussion. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for your expert opinion. Your point was taken, it's noted. Speaking of some shortage of grain and wheat, gas, climate change, which we shouldn't forget about, because climate change is one thing that we Africans we should look at carefully before it becomes a very issue for us. The issue of gas too is very important because we have little oil production country in Africa. So at this stage, all of the African countries, the increase of gas is at a high peak, where we're experiencing shortage of gas in our country, to be specific, Liberia. I know it is across the nation. The issue of grains and wheat, we yet to experience such, but we will experience it times to come because we are still getting used to our African dish. So we will get used to this. I thank you for your presentation. It was very much educative. The last panel on our list is Baroness Dion Ako-Adovo. Mistress Ako-Adovo is the CEO of Dion Van In Limited, a representative of Transitor Group Manufacturers, QMS for Africa, founder of IECA, the International Education Connect Agency, Go Africa Brand, a non-profit organization with affiliates in the sub-region to promote the need for subsidized living, skill training, capacity building, and wealth creation for students and youth in Africa. SWIFT Africa is another non-profit initiative recently created to enhance and foster unity among the youth and students of Africa, and though a channel to create, maintain, and sustain peace in sub-region. Mistress Ako-Adovo, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, can you just put your camera on? Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now the stage is yours. Now the stage is yours. You can give your thoughts and implications on the war of Ukraine and Russia. So the stage is yours now, Mistress Ako-Adovo.
Thank you, Tyson, for that introduction. I want to say thank you for the eye-openers for my four speakers, Mr. Gerson and Brenna Brown. Thank you very much. Russia invades Ukraine, war in Europe, and what this could mean for Africa. Russia's invasion of Ukraine's Donbas region, which transformed into a war on the 24th of February, has resulted in global economic security concerns with severe consequences on African continent, as my four speakers rightly said. In this regard, there are economic opportunities for some oil exporting countries in this region, especially in terms of natural gas and raw material exports, with the sanctions implemented by the United States and European countries against Russia. On the other hand, countries whose industries and agriculture are heavily dependent on oil exports have the potential to enter an economic bottleneck because of the increase in oil and natural gas prices. The same is true for grain trade. The fact that Russia and Ukraine, as we have already have privy to, provide 25% of the world's grain supply may indirectly lead the African continent as one of its largest customers into a food insecurity. Russia and Ukraine have major ties with Africa. I'll just mention a few of these areas, that is in defense and security, energy, agriculture, and education. In energy, experts have warned sternly as Russian missiles hit Ukraine that the impact of the war will reverberate across the continent of Africa. Over the past weeks, fuel prices in Ghana and other African countries have drastically increased. As of March 7th last week, the price of gasoline in Ghana was 8 cedi 62 pesos, which is about $1.30 for a liter of gasoline, and which is a 25% increase since January the 3rd. Economists have cautioned that the war in Ukraine could push further oil prices up and increase inflation in the whole of Africa. Professor Abdul Ganigu Gaba of the Department of Economics in Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria, said the last time we had a windfall from oil prices related to war was in 1991 during the Gulf War. There is no doubt that this crisis will directly impact the price of crude oil. Africa, like most continents, will need to prepare for higher inflation as the increase in crude oil prices will increase inflation globally and lead to expensive imports. Most African countries have not recovered from the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in the rise of commodity prices due to the disruption of global chain supply. It has been extremely difficult and unbearable for most people living in Africa, and I would say the world at large. With the outbreak of the Russian war, the US and European countries imposed various sanctions against Russia, a country that supplies 40% of the European Union's natural gas. Countries in the Middle East and Africa are emerging as strong alternative for Europe as it attempts to diversify its natural gas supply and cuts its dependency on Russia. At this point, many African countries like Algeria is a suitable alternative in terms of both geopolitical position and its large reserves. Additionally, countries like Senegal, where we have 40 trillion cubic feet of natural gas discovered between 2014 and 2017, with production expected to start later this year. Nigeria is an existing supplier of LNG, liquefied natural gas, to several European countries. And Tanzania seems to be at an advantage with their natural gas capacity. In this sense, Nigeria, Niger, and Algeria, which are the trans-Saharan gas pipeline roads, cooperated in order to increase their natural gas exports to the European markets and have signed an agreement on February the 16th, just passed. The deal includes a cost of $13 billion to renew these pipelines. Apart from this line, a total of 15 billion cubic meters of Algerian natural gas is transported to Europe via the Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline and the Trans-Mediterranean gas pipeline. However, the increase in natural gas and oil prices may result in additional costs for oil importing African countries that depend on oil and natural gas in agricultural and industrial productions. For agriculture, the Russian-Ukraine war has affected negatively Africa in terms of its production and food security, as both countries are important grain exporters to Africa. As we have already heard from my four speakers, African countries imported about $4 billion agricultural products from Russia, in which wheat accounted for 90% of all these exports. Ukraine exported $2.9 billion worth of agricultural produce to Africa in 2020, in which wheat was representing 48% of these products. Corn represented 31%. Furthermore, these two countries have a total share of 26% in the world wheat exports. While Egypt ranks first in wheat imports, countries like Libya, Sudan, Nigeria, Tanzania, Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa also import wheat from Russia and Ukraine to a large extent. Currently, with the Russian intervention in Ukraine, corn prices have increased by 21%. Wheat has increased by 35% and soybean by 20%. Nonetheless, the Sahel region and West Africa alone, 26 million people do not have access to enough food. Therefore, the prolongation of the war and the disruption of agricultural trade can cause prices to rise significantly. In the increase in bread prices, especially in Kenya and Sudan, has led to anti-government protests already. Undoubtedly, this situation brings food security concerns again to the forefront for Africa, which has experienced many food crises in the past. Defense and security. The Russian mercenaries Wagner Group operates in the Central African Republic, Libya, Mozambique, and Mali. Apart from this, Russia has strong trade relations with African economies such as South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Sudan. In this context, Russia's military and economic connections have limited member countries of the African Union from acting in unison against the Russia-Ukraine war. The Union's own legislation emphasizes the inviolability of the borders and territorial integrity. Education. Over 16,000 African students are studying in Ukraine and Russia. These are all stranded as a result of the war. African countries have evacuated most of their students. Many of them remain trapped though without food, water, or limited food and water, and with practically no safe shelter. This is heartbreaking to most of the African families affected. In conclusion, I would say the Ukraine-Russia war, which broke out after Russia's one-sided intervention is geographically far from the region, but still closely concerns Africa as a whole, or the continent of Africa. Many different issues such as food security, agricultural production, and inclusion of countries with natural gas reserves into geopolitical equation due to the sanctions on Russia are also directly related, as I have stated. In this context, prolonging the war and continuing to sanction Russia will increase the prices of agricultural products and raw materials, which could expose the African continent to more food security crisis. I wish to end my talk here and say thank you again to my four speakers, Mr. Gerson and Lorena Brown, and to you, Tyson, and Stephanie, and Ernest at IPB. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was very much marvelous. Now, your presentation actually got few points. The issue of opportunity for Africa, one. The issue of disadvantage for Africa, two. Which we need to look at carefully. The issue of increase in gas and oil in Africa. So these are things that we look at carefully as the implication in Africa. Now we will turn to the audience participant. If you have any question, you can drop your question in the chat box, or you can ask question. Please ask one question. Please ask one question because of time. Please ask one question. So the floor is open to the audience or the participant to ask their question. Okay, I want to direct this question to my first speaker, Mr. Carson. Are you there, Mr. Carson? My question is, you previously spoke of discrimination, but in your discrimination, you mentioned about Ukraine who are being blocked at the borders point, Poland and other areas. I did not hear you speaking of Africans who was denied of getting on the subway, which is a train or other buses to go to the safe region. In that note, how can you tell us as Africans why it is that we are in sympathy with Ukraine and Ukraine soldiers are discriminating Africans with that of Ukraine citizens? Can you speak on that for us, please?
Sure. You know, I wish it weren't so, but this has a very, very long history, right? You know, you look at the rise of the West, which was largely based on slavery and you know, the enslavement of African peoples to work initially in the Americas, but also there were African slaves in portions of Europe as well. And in order to maintain this brutal injustice, the white Europeans and white Americans developed an outrageous worldview that Africans were less human than white people. And this is something which has persisted certainly in portions of Europe and in many of the American countries. And it's not limited exclusively to African people, right? You know, in Europe, the majority population, the majority Christian population, could not tolerate, for many of them, not all Christians, obviously, but many of them could not tolerate the existence of Jewish or Muslim alternative religious beliefs. And so you had, for example, in Spain, you had the Inquisition, in which people were forced to, sometimes under torture, to convert to Christianity or be killed. And of course, many then fled back to Africa or even to the Americas. And this long tradition of anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic beliefs certainly played out, you know, during Hitler's reign and the Holocaust. And you know, the unfortunate reality is that both Russians and Ukrainians were brutal in relationship to their Jewish population. Not all Ukrainians, not all Russians. And as we've seen in the first part of this century, you know, European and American racism, harsh discrimination, and worse in relationship to Muslim people has been atrocious and to be condemned. You know, there are important traditions in Europe and in the United States among white people and other parts of the Americas who recognize just absolutely how wrong this is and who have been working against it and protesting it for a long time. I apologize for not including in my talk the reports that we've seen here in the U.S. press about African students and other Africans in Ukraine who've been trying to get out and being held back at the borders of Poland. I don't know if other countries as well. So this obviously is it's an atrocity. And the reality is that we share our humanness. We share, security has to be mutual, and this is something that we have to work against. I mean, one thing here in the United States, there's been very little thinking about the impacts of the war on Africa. So I'm looking forward. I sent a note in the chat to Baroness asking if she could send me the text of her speech, because that's the kind of thing that people here will find to be important news. And also just to say, in my organization, a number of the board members and people who help us are what we call people of color, African, Asian, Arab. So having this additional information will be very valued by them.
Thank you for that brilliant answer. Any other question from the audience? Any question from the audience?
I have a question to Baroness Dane.
Yeah.
Baroness, my question is, in addition to what you were saying, do you also see that the climate change will deepen all these problems and maybe even develop a new quality of all these problems? That the combination of these war and the climate change will really develop a really big economic and social crisis in the whole continent.
Baroness, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you, Rena. Yes, certainly. Already, Africa is already experiencing the effects of the climate change, which we have to deal with, and certainly it's going to be very, I don't want to use the word catastrophic, but Africa stands at really being hit by this war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and also issues of climate change that is hitting us already. There is a lot of famine already in most parts of Africa, South Sudan and Central Africa, and even in some parts of the Sahel, we have fair issues regarding climate change that we are. So yes, Rena, it will be very, the impacts will be quite serious in Africa.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other questions from any questions from the audience?
I would just be curious in terms of what countries the different participants in this webinar are from. And so if people could put in the chat where they're from, that would be very helpful to know.
Okay. Yeah, there's a question. There's a question here I want to ask. It's from Messi D. Sunrise, everyone. The question is, do you have any advice for decision makers during the war? This question goes across the board. Someone sent this question in the chat room, but it was not directed to a specific person. So I want to ask as to whether, do you have any advice for decision makers during this war?
Yeah, they should stop it. I mean,
That's
the most
all right.
immediate thing is they should stop it.
But you know,
Okay.
you should say both sides. They are responsible for having this war, and this creates both sides. This is not only Putin who makes the final aggression, but the preparation of the war and that it comes to this situation was also done by NATO and the Western countries by not accepting the security interests of Russia for about 20 years. So the war has also a pre-story. And now, you know, what is needed now, for my understanding, are so quick as possible negotiation on the highest level. I think we need a meeting of the two presidents, Putin and Zelensky. I think Jerusalem is a good place. And then we should immediately need a ceasefire. And Russia should bring the troops home. And then I think Joseph mentioned it. We need a deeper discussion about what is the security structure for Europe, that Europe can play a responsible role in the whole world. And that is a discussion I think we are responsible for, that we have to organize. For us in Europe, it means we have to prepare a much deeper discussion about common security and what we are calling the Helsinki II process, the process to a new agreement about common security structures in Europe. And I think we also need a discussion about what does common security means for Africa, because Africa common security is not only Africa, like European common security is not only the European country, it includes Canada and the United States. And I think in Africa, there are also other countries which must be a part of a common security structure in Africa. This needs a much, much deeper discussion. I think in every crisis, there's also a chance. Maybe this is the chance to put this now on the agenda, even when I would be happy not to have this chance now by such a war, such a brutal war. But let's take it like it is, and then say, let's try to use the chance for a new discussion also on the common security structure of Africa.
So I would just jump in to say, you know, on the one hand, the war is not over, and we face really continuing dangers, and we have to do all that we can to prevent it being escalated. At the same time, you know, as Baroness especially was talking, but Reiner as well. I mean, the consequences of this war are not limited to Europe. I mean, they're global and they're huge. And in a worst case scenario, if it escalates to nuclear exchanges, that brings on the dangers of even of nuclear winter, which could basically eliminate just about all of human life. So certainly that would impact Africa. And the crisis has been described by some, including some people we're in touch with in Russia, as being a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. In the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962, without going into great detail about it, that was the closest the world has come to a great power nuclear exchange, which would have essentially eliminated all life. People in the Kennedy administration at the time thought that the chances that the US would initiate a nuclear war at that time were between 30 and 50%. So we're in a very, very dangerous moment. As Baroness was indicating, there are also opportunities, and I guess Reiner as well, there are opportunities in this crisis. We need to use it as a mirror. Just as after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it led to negotiations of the nuclear weapons testing ban, at least atmospheric, and a reduction of the Cold War. In fact, Kennedy may have been assassinated because of lessons he learned in his efforts to end the Cold War. We need to use this crisis as a way for humanity to confront the possibility of what it might do to itself, what it's doing and what it might do to itself. And so this means, I think, demands from all over the world, not just in the Caucasian Western world, for, as Reiner was saying, common security alternatives, common security negotiations, to look at the threats to human survival, the two greatest being nuclear weapons and the climate, and for us to really collaborate and work together for the sake of the future. If you look at Reiner's hair and my hair, you'll know that we're not going to be around forever. But for those of you who are younger, I mean, this is an immediate threat to your future, and we have to work together in order to prevent both the escalation of this war and for long-term human survival.
Thank you ever so much for that brilliant articulation. Now I have one question from Baroness. During the period of explanation or presentation, I did hear her saying that this war is an opportunity for few African countries. This war serve as a serious impediment for Africans. How can this war, Russia and Ukraine, serve as opportunity for some African countries? Baroness, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Thank you. I thank you. I think this is actually an answer to the second part of Reiner's question, Mr. Reiner Brown's question, which I would have answered anyway. Yeah, so I'm looking at the entire crisis or the entire situation now with another lens, for Africa, that I believe, yes, it is difficult. Yes, we are suffering. Yes, every single country now in Africa is being hit already by the consequences, because we have not finished managing our post-COVID pandemic situation and crisis as well. But on the other side, I feel it's a wake-up call for Africa to wake up and from their slumber, to wake up from being spoon-fed, to wake up and say, hey, we have to try and make it. Gerson and Reiner have fed us for long. Africa must now start feeding themselves. We need to see
the story of Africa.
We can actually invest in research into agriculture to see the kind of crops, high yielding crops which will grow in shorter time. We don't like to do that. And it's a time for us to open our eyes to the reality. Those who have fed us are in crisis, they are in trouble all over the world. What are we going to do to help ourselves not run into poverty and hunger? Then we have to look at our schools. A lot of the people going to Russia and Ukraine is to study medicine because it's cheaper and they have more access there. What are we doing as Africa? We need to sit down and also consider how we can develop ourselves and our continent and our individual nations. We also need to calm down on coup d'etats and power, hunger, and actually know that we need to be more democratic, and be able to be. It's time for us to be self-reliant, and self-sufficient. So I think Africa must wake up to its natural resources, which we have lots. Otherwise, like Reiner said and Gerson, they are going to come back and take it away from us and sell it to us.
Thank you so much. Retelling the story of Africa by Africans. Wow, this is very much motivating. These questions go across the board. Is by Mohamed B. Abubakar from Nigeria. Mohamed said, how can organizations like African UN help address some of these consequences mentioned both on a short-term and on a long-term basis? Anybody can answer such question.
I think we need to look to Baroness for that. I'm not in a position to really
No,
answer.
no, that is a question to you, Tyson, and to your Ernest and to Baroness. You should answer, or you should discuss about this question, and we should listen to it.
This question
Okay, then I think Tyson would answer.
What we as Africans we need to do is to engage the AU, how well they can encourage or put forth one of the leaders of Africa in addressing such issues. So I think we need to come up with another web banner that will address this issue. This is a serious issue of Africa, because the leadership of Africa, we observe that they have gone ceremoniously. So we need to know how well they are addressing such issues of this Ukraine-Russia war. On this note, if no other question, I want for each of the panelists to give their final statement on such presentation. So we will first start with Mr. Joseph Carlson. Mr. Carlson, what is your final statement?
So I want to thank Ernest and IPB for the opportunity to join this session. You know, I found Reiner's overview very helpful, and Baroness's talk. Much of that was relatively new, certainly at the cutting edge for me, and I look forward, as I said before, to sharing her talk with people here in the United States. You know, I'll just say, you know, I grew up, I was socialized, I'm Jewish. I was born very shortly after the Holocaust in Europe. I have family in Europe who did not survive. And I was also deeply involved as a young person in the civil rights movement here in the 1960s. For racial equality and justice, and out of those, I guess you'd say, out of those forges, you know, I've learned to think that we have, if we really believe in justice, if we really believe that life is sacred, then we have to live our lives on that basis. You know, here in the United States, anyhow, far too many people, you know, spend their lives at shopping malls, on television, and in the midst of poverty and violence and injustice. And so I would just appeal to people, if you believe that life and justice and your family are of the greatest value, then we have to live, and that means we have to live out those values. And that means, as Baroness was talking, development of our communities, becoming self-reliant, working to reduce violence, to build common security between our countries, not only the great powers, but in our communities and in our regions. And it means finding ways to collaborate, as on this call, to work for peace, for justice, and common security. So only, I guess, only to say that I'm glad for the contacts made in this, maybe some new friendships, and I look forward to working with people who are on this call.
Thank you. Now, Ronnie, your last statement.
You know, what I learned in the preparation of this Zoom call is that what global consequences has such a regional war. And this brings me back to the old point of the founding of IPB. When we really want to have a justice world with friendship relation to nature, we have to overcome war. War and development, both together, is not possible. And this regional war underlined that in this global world, we can only develop something when we are abolishing war. This brings the question of abolishing war for me again on the agenda, and showed on one side how clever the old IPB people were more than 130 years ago to say we need a world without war. And now we can see that by even in relation to the world wars, such a small war has so immense consequences on Africa. And we will discuss it in IPB the next week, what are the consequences for Asia, and say we also have dramatic consequences for Asia. We have consequences for the normal people in the US and in Europe. And this shows to me militarization and human development is not possible, either one side or the other side. In this case, I can only say, I learned again by this webinar how important it is that we continue our fight for a world without war and for disarmament. And thank you all for joining. I learned again a lot by the preparation and by this webinar.
Thank you, and thank you again. Baroness, are you there? Your last word? Final statement?
Thank you. Thank you, Tyson. And it's also been a pleasure being on this webinar with Joseph Gerson and Rena Brown. It's been a wonderful exposition and eye-opening from the two speakers from IPB. I would love to work with you, Mr. Brown. And I will say that Africa is, although we are rich in maybe human resource and natural resource as well, we are very, very feeble. Africa is not as strong as the rest of the world. And so I would like to say that although NATO and the US and United Nations and all the allies, EU, are all doing what they can in their various capacities, we wish to ask that they speeding up talks and negotiations so that peace can prevail. Otherwise, it looks like this will become a bit unbearable. So I pray that tempest will come down, whilst I pray that Africa is going to wake up to the new world and try to make something of the continent, which they can. And thank you very much, everybody. And I'm always at your disposal to help us all achieve a good world.
Tyson, you are mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Anyone for you, Ernest?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for the support, and I thank Joseph, Rena, Baroness for their cooperation. And I also thank you, Tyson, for supporting us to organize this webinar. We are looking up to organizing a more bigger webinar to find solutions to the problems of the world. Thank you. Tyson, you are still on mute.
Stephanie, any closing statement for you? Any statement?
No, thank you.
Okay, then. I want to appreciate
Joseph, I'm going to share the information with you, and I will share Baroness's statement with Joseph and Raina, and I will also share the list of the countries our participants are coming from. Thank you.
I want to appreciate all of the panelists. It was nice interacting with you, serving as moderator for this important and educative webinar. I would like to appreciate you guys that you tried to support us in such endeavor in conducting more webinar that will inform you guys and invite you to speak on more webinar as time comes. So thank you ever so much. It was nice interacting with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you. Be well.
Okay then. Bye-bye. The school organizing.